here we are, and welcome, extending you all a very warm welcome to this Gender and Social Policy webinar. We're absolutely delighted and really honoured that Dr. Jane Pillinger is our guest, has accepted to be our guest speaker today. And Jane is an independent social policy researcher, and she's based in France. She has a truly illustrious record of fantastic policy oriented, activist oriented, advocacy oriented social policy research, and she works with a whole range of international agencies, both state and non-state. We're also very lucky that she's our visiting fellow in social policy and criminology in FAS, and she's also a good friend of IKD, which is Innovation, Knowledge and Development, the thematic network which hosts this series. So as Lorena said, we are recording this session, and it will be available on the IKD website subsequently. So Jane will be talking today about her new book, her newest book, because I think she had some others recently as well. So this is the newest of the new crop. And the book is titled Stopping Gender-Based Violence and Harassment at Work, the Campaign for an ILO Convention. So I'm going to be operating the slides, I'm afraid. So Jane, if you could just tell me when you want me to turn the page, as it were, and I'll do that for you. So Jane's going to speak for about kind of half an hour. We have a full hour this morning, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion. Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's go.
Thank you, Nicola, so much for such a lovely introduction. I've never been described as illustrious, so that is lovely. Thank you. So as I said, thanks ever so much for inviting me to the Gender and Social Policy Group meeting today. I'm really, really delighted to be here, and I'm also really honoured myself to be a visiting fellow at the Open University. I have a background in social policy, but I work as an independent researcher, as Nicola said, mainly with international organisations, with governments, with employers, but mostly in the last few years with global union federations on this campaign for a global treaty. And maybe I can just start by saying a few words about the context of this. The International Labour Organization, some of you may be familiar with it, others of you not. So I'll just give you a very brief introduction to it. The International Labour Organization was established, I think it was in 1919, actually just after the First World War, as a basis for human rights, very early formulation of human rights, but principally focused on social justice. And the basis for lasting peace. And it became a UN agency in 1946. And it's effectively the part of the United Nations family that deals with international labour standards, decent work, social justice, and particularly rights at work. And for those of you that are not so familiar with the International Labour Organization, their main focus has been, first of all, on establishing fundamental rights at work. And that's in areas such as freedom of association and the right of collective bargaining for trade unions, in areas such as non-discrimination in employment, also areas such as no child labour, no forced labour, no slavery, and so on. So those are kind of fundamental conventions that are applicable to all members. And the International Labour Organization is a tripartite organization, which means that it's made up of governments, employers, and trade unions. And the ILO refers to the trade unions as workers' organisations. And this is a unique form of tripartite, I've just seen somebody saying if you save your presentation as a PDF, it might work better. Okay, let me try and do that and maybe I can get it up. I'll try and talk while I'm doing this. It's unique in the sense that it brings together this tripartite group of agencies into one decision-making structure. And one of the really important parts of this decision-making process is the formulation of international labour organisation conventions. A convention is binding on member states, and once a member state has ratified a convention, it's binding on them. And then associated with this are some what we call recommendations, which really go into recommending the types of actions that can help with implementing a convention. Right, I'm just going to see if the PDF will share. No, can't see a PDF. That doesn't seem to be working either. Anyway, I shall continue. So with this overall framework of International Labour Organization conventions, to date, there have been 190 conventions adopted and 206 recommendations. And the most recent convention adopted was ILO Convention number 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work. And this is what I'm going to be talking about, because there was a whole global campaign around the formulation of this new convention. And I'd argue a campaign that is unprecedented in both ILO history, but also in the impact of a global social movement. So I'm going to say a few words about the book itself and what we try to do in the book. And if I had some slides, I'd be showing this to you at the moment, so I'm very sorry it's not there. But what we wanted to do in the book...
I have the slides now. Do you want me to try to do it?
Yes, please.
Can you see my screen?
I can. Fantastic.
Which slides do you want?
Just go on to the second slide, please. If you could put it on full screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So, maybe just go back to the first screen, actually, because there's a picture of the book. And I just wanted to say this book, the women that are on the front of the book are typical of many of the women who organised campaigns on against gender-based violence. And these were the women who were working in the markets in Nigeria, who with the Nigerian Labour Congress had an amazing campaign of informal market traders who put in place policies and protocols to end gender-based violence in the markets themselves. And if any of you have ever been to a Nigerian market, they're huge. And most people do their shopping in the markets, and they're mostly women who are working there. There are all sorts of problems about violence in the markets, rape, child sexual abuse and child rape, because the women take their children with them to the markets because they don't have access to childcare, around the toilet facilities and so on. So these amazing, beautiful women did the most incredible campaign in Nigeria around the ratification of Convention 190 and have changed the perspective of the government. So on to the next slide, I'll just say briefly about what the book aims to do. So first of all, it's a case study of a global social movement that influenced global human rights policy making, and I have to say in an unprecedented way. It's an exploration of the gendered divisions of power, of intersectionality, and of collective action led by women disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. And I say the women disproportionately affected because we tried to focus mostly on the women who are most likely to experience gender-based violence, but who are have least protections available to them. So one of the things we wanted to do was to ensure that we gave voice to the women in their campaigns of informal women workers, transport workers, public sector workers on the front line of providing services, who are often also disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. It's also an example of the feminization of trade unionism and of women's workers' organisation and of women's organising. And it's a detailed insight into tripartism and the negotiation of an ILO convention. And what we wanted to do was to try and cover all of these aims in the book, to give both voice to the campaign and to really, mark it as an important moment in our history. I mean, in fact, that was the reason that we decided to write the book in the first place. We were at the second part of the negotiations for an ILO convention, and myself and the two co-authors decided this was an important moment to capture this unprecedented movement in our history, in our labour history in particular. So what we tried to do is also give an insight into the nuances, the complexities, the different forms of negotiations that were used to get this convention adopted, and indeed to the skillful work carried out by some of the governments, but also the workers' group, who, in an unprecedented way, carried out negotiations that were led by women of colour, but were done with huge amounts of preparation, of rehearsals, of evidence that was collected across the world by the trade union movement. So just on to the next slide, please. So we had 6 campaign themes. There are a few photographs around this, so you won't be able to see them now, but never mind. So the campaigns, how the campaign worked was that there was a global campaign, and then trade unions and workers' organisations and women's organisations at the national level then organised their own campaign themes, and they included 6 main themes of types of campaigning to get first the adoption of the convention and then its ratification. So this involved lobbying, awareness raising and discussion with government representatives and building alliances for this purpose. It included a huge programme of awareness raising about gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, and of building women's agency, power and voice in their unions, helping to amplify women's voices and bringing women's experiences into the negotiations. And that was, again, something very, very unique. And the global unions played a very big role in helping to build women's agency and voice in this process. It's an inclusive and intersectional approach, as I mentioned, and this brought the campaign focus on campaigning with women disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. A lot of the unions collected multiple examples of some really horrendous, difficult and problematic experiences that women have experienced in the workplace. They conducted their own participatory research and really helped to give evidence to the significant problems across different sectors, at different countries, in both informal and formal sectors of the economy. It's also a big emphasis was given to collecting women's experiences of domestic violence, because one of the contested areas in the negotiations, coming from the employers principally, was that domestic violence as a form of gender-based violence impacts on the workplace, and many employers didn't want responsibilities put on employers' organisations to mitigate those impacts. So there was a massive global drive to collect examples of the impact of domestic violence, and something like 20 surveys covering more than 50,000 workers across the world were carried out on this issue. Engagement with employers and progressive companies, and in fact some of the really good examples of collaboration between the trade unions and the NGOs, who were able to use their contacts and lobby and influence employers' organisations. So, for example, at the global level, there have been something like 50 global framework agreements that have been agreed between the global unions and multinational companies, many of which also cover gender-based violence and sexual harassment. So working through those global framework agreements, it was possible to get the multinational companies to stand behind the convention, and that became a very powerful force. And then after the ratification of the convention in June 29, just after the first standard setting, but just after the ratification, we saw a big increase in the numbers of human rights global organisations across the world who banded together with the trade unions to really amplify the campaign even further. So the big kind of organizations like Care International, ActionAid International, Human Rights Watch, all of those big NGOs were mobilized by the trade unions to participate in these campaigns. And that really brought some extra force to the campaign itself. Next slide, please. So the first, I mean, perhaps just by way of context, the campaign started in about 2012, 2013, to get the issue on the agenda of the International Labour Organization. And the International Trade Union Confederation had been campaigning for many years to get this into global attention. It predated the Me Too movement. But while it strengthened, Me Too strengthened the campaign significantly because no government and no employer wanted to be seen to be against or voting against what in effect had become the global Me Too campaign. And there were many iterations of it across the world. Me Too didn't actually reach the women who were disproportionately affected by gender-based violence and harassment. The women on precarious contracts in the garment sector, the domestic workers facing horrendous forms of violence and harassment, informal workers on the streets, none of those women really were part of the Me Too campaign. But it helped to strengthen the global lobbying, and that was key. In Latin America, the campaign came from a very strong feminist labor movement alliance, part of Ni Menos, which came about, it was not one more woman, which came about from the huge campaign in Latin American countries against femicide. And Ni Menos was really, really crucial as part of the campaign across that whole region, and was a very strong force of alliance from the very beginning of feminist organizations and trade unions. The two were very, very closely connected. And as I mentioned, after 2018, more international NGOs became active and partnered with trade unions, particularly during the ratification process. And an unprecedented global campaign prior to ratification of more than 500 campaigns in over 50 countries. And it called for simply a feminist world of work, stop gender-based violence. And this is the first attempt at the global campaign, really reaching out to trade unions across the world in 23 days of activism in 2018. And for 23 days, leading up to the first negotiations that took place at the International Labour Conference, here we had over 500 campaigns in over 50 countries. It was really amazing. We watched this in awe, actually, of what the simple message of stop gender-based violence at work resonated with women across the world in the way that perhaps hadn't resonated with women through the Me Too movement and so on. So next slide, please. These are the campaign logos. So the first one on the left there, stop with the hand, stop gender-based violence at work, was translated into multiple languages and used across the world. We saw it in countries in all regions of the world being used and local levels by women, domestic workers, informal workers, factory workers, and so on. And then the one on the right is the second logo that was used once the convention was adopted. So it was about the campaign for ratification of Convention 190. And then the poster in the middle was another poster used that was a collaboration between all of the global unions and unions across the world. It can change lives. Next slide, please. So, we do have a few of brilliant. Yes, so some of the photos have come through. That's fantastic. So just to give you a very quick flavour, really, of what the campaign looked like. The top slide there was a campaign in Indonesia. In Indonesia, they had this amazing campaign which brought together nationally all the trade unions and feminist and women's organisations across the country into the No GBV Alliance, they called it. And this was an example of one of the campaign activities by Industrial Global Union, who had done a very big campaign across their sectors, electronics, garments, mining, you name it, in all of those manufacturing industries. The second one below is of women garment workers in Bangladesh who mobilized around the convention. And one of the extraordinary things was to then discover, when we talked to the women in Bangladesh and Cambodia working in garment factories at the end of global supply chains, they all said, we need Convention 190. And the way that the convention had come into regular discourse amongst women disproportionately affected by gender-based violence was quite extraordinary. And then the lovely purple photograph was from Uruguay, where the women had, this was one of the demonstrations that was held in Uruguay just prior to Uruguay ratifying the convention. And it was of both, it was led by the PITC union, and it engaged very, very strongly with feminist organizations as well. So just to the next slide, please. You'll see the slide on the left. This was the International Women's Day campaign for the unions in Europe. And in fact, that little bubble became a poster. So people put that into their workplaces, and the poster was made into it was like a hand on that kind of teardrop, and it just said gender-based violence-free workplaces. So everybody involved in the campaign across Europe, maybe you had some in your university, because the university unions were very involved in the campaign actually in the UK. We saw those all across the whole of Europe in workplaces to raise awareness. The one on the right actually was a campaign that was organised originally by the Latin American unions in the construction sector, and then became a global union campaign from the BWI, the Building and Workers International. And it was designed by an artist in Australia for the Safe at Work, Safe at Home campaign amongst the building and construction sector in Australia. And in fact, they were supposed to have, it was just before the pandemic started, and they were supposed to go to their global union congress in Madrid for the whole construction sector unions, and the pandemic hit. So what they did in the end was they donated the artwork to all of the construction unions to do in whatever way they wanted. And this was one of the ones that actually gives the symbol. You see the crane in the middle, that was the symbol of the crane that the women in the construction unions had in Ukraine, had a big sign at the top of, and this was in Kiev just in 2019, and they hung the flag, the Ukraine flag, and the Stop Gender-Based Violence flag on the top of the crane. So a lot of construction workers in Ukraine are women. And it just seems really, when I think of those amazing women who ran that campaign, where they are now, how they're dealing with this horrendous conflict and invasion of Ukraine. So we did actually have quite a lot of discussions with the women in the construction sector in Ukraine at the beginning of the invasion to give them some support. Next slide, please. Oh, this was, excuse me, I beg your pardon. I just wanted to say, every year there is 16 days of action. You probably may have come across this in the UK. Every year, starting on the 25th of November and coming up to Human Rights Day, there's 16 days of activism across the world of trade unions, NGOs, governments, UN agencies, they all participate in it. And that was a very big focal point for the campaign for the convention over in 2018, 2019 and 2020. The themes of 16 days of activism was to end gender-based violence at work. So coming on to the negotiations themselves, we documented in detail the negotiations and how they played out, and how the workers group gave voice to the women disproportionately affected. And here's just 10 steps that were involved in the campaign itself. In the book, we really follow this schema, and we look at the different institutional mechanisms, and alongside that, we look at the campaign responses. So first of all, the ILO governing body, number 325, in November 2015, after many attempts by the workers group, finally agreed to have a standard setting item on violence and harassment in the world of work. This is how it works in the ILO. You have to get agreement to have a process of negotiations. At the time, the employers refused for it to go into a discussion about a convention and argued instead that there should be a tripartite meeting of experts to explore this further, and that they should then report back to the governing body in November 2016. I was one of the experts on the tripartite meeting of experts, and it was a really unbelievable, transformational meeting in many respects, because the workers group, led by the chairperson, Kathleen Pachier, who is a very experienced lawyer, she's now currently the chair of the workers group in the ILO and a vice chair of the ILO governing body, skillfully navigated a whole series of negotiations with the employers and the governments. And we managed in that meeting to ensure that there was recognition of domestic violence as a world of work issue, and that a whole other set of principles were to be included. So it set the frame. And at that stage, the ILO realised that actually there is now sufficient support for a convention. So there's various things that happen. There's a ILO law and practice report and a questionnaire of all the governments across the world. Then there's a response to the questionnaire in the so-called Yellow Report. And then you have the first standard setting committee. And the standard setting committee was in two parts, 2018 and 2019. And it was a week of negotiations, often going into very late in the night, and a very difficult outcome, and one that people at the end of the standard setting committee in June 2018 thought, we've lost this, or potentially we've lost this. But everybody regrouped in the campaign. There was a huge amount of international attention given to it. And then there was another report seeking reviews from governments. And then there was the Blue Report, which effectively set out the text of the proposed convention and recommendation that under 8 was then negotiated at the 2019 Standard Setting Committee. And finally, there was a vote on the 21st of June 2019 by the full International Labour Conference, which is the decision body of the ILO, for a convention supported by a recommendation. And then effectively, the convention came into force after 2 member states had ratified the convention. So it was ratified very quickly by Uruguay and Fiji, and there were strong campaigns in those countries to get early ratification. And so far, 11 countries have ratified the convention, including the UK just last month. And there are hundreds of countries ready very, very soon to ratify the convention. And it's likely to be a very highly ratified convention, which is good news. And next slide, please. So this was the meeting of experts. These were the women experts from across the world who came together to negotiate that first meeting of experts in 2016, and in effect, really set out the framework of the convention. You see Kathleen Pachier is in the middle sitting down. She was the workers' spokesperson, and there were representatives from all regions. So next slide, please. And then this is the standard setting committee. So if you've ever heard of what a standard setting committee is, there's the photograph of the standard setting committee itself. So it met in 2018 and 2019. On the left-hand side of the photograph are the workers group. There were over 400 workers who turned up to be part of these negotiations, and it was impossible to get seats most days. And you'll see the workers are all kind of holding up their hands. In the middle are the governments, and on the right-hand side are the employers. And the process of negotiations was organised around separate constituents meetings, then full meetings that often went on till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. A lot of very exhausted people, very, very highly charged negotiations, incredible staying power, and real backwards and forwards into very, very, very nuanced and very complex negotiating points. And one of the things that was really interesting during the negotiations, whenever there was a sticking point or a potential area of conflict with the employers, the workers' groups rushed off to then negotiate with their counterparts in their own countries. And this worked very well, and there was very strong building of trust and alliances with governments, particularly in the Africa group. And there was very strong, extremely strong support from the European Union countries led by France, the spokesperson from France, who really, managed to keep the issue on the agenda and at times was able to broker between conflicts between the workers' groups and the workers' group and the employers. So there is the, I just saw a question, how did 400 people negotiate? Well, there's 400. Okay, so how it worked in practice, each of the 3 groups has a spokesperson. And on the front of the spokesperson's front desk is what's called a bureau. And there'll be about 10 key people who are there negotiating on the front line of the negotiations. Everybody sitting behind is feeding ideas, information through the bureau members, who then meet with, on separate occasions, with the spokesperson. So at the back of the stage there are meeting rooms where separate meetings are held during the negotiations. Then you come back into the tripartite negotiations. So there's a kind of process, and at the beginning, all these amazing 400 women from across the world who were representing their unions wanted to be an active part of it, and it was really important to try and contain that a little bit and to enable them to have a process through their regional groups into the bureau. So the only negotiations that you heard were actually the voices of the 3 spokespersons who did the key negotiations and who were able to bring in the voices of each of their representatives in the different countries and so on. And prior to the Standard Setting Committee, there was a massive programme of research, of documenting examples. I was there as the expert to the workers' group, feeding through relevant examples as they came up. So when the employers said, well, we can't deal with domestic violence because employers aren't responsible for domestic violence, I was able to then pass a note to the spokesperson to say, well, here are all of the global and national and local agreements on domestic violence that have been negotiated with employers. So we had collected something like 500 examples of ways that employers had already done work on domestic violence, which kind of helped to really change their position a little bit. So next slide, please. So that was the negotiations. This is from Rose Amano, who is from she's the General Secretary of the Metal Workers Union in Kenya. And I thought her quote here, we interviewed all of these people for the book. We interviewed them after the negotiations had happened. And she said, I was determined to get to Geneva to be part of the negotiations because it was dear to my heart. And I had serious reasons why I wanted to see this convention negotiated, adopted and implemented. Although I'm not a legal person, I wanted to understand what Convention 190 it would mean to me, to the women I represent and workers at large. I had to listen keenly to the discussions, to the employers and what they wanted, to follow the amendments. We brought examples of best practice to share with workers' representatives, to make sure that when that's the workers' spokesperson, who was a woman of colour from Canada, presented our case, there were tangible things for her to refer to. I would lobby the African government to make sure that they supported us in our demand proposals, to explain why we were making these proposals. So I think she gives a little bit of an insight into, you know, this kind of complex series of negotiations that took place. And she was an amazing advocate all the way through this campaign, through her global union industrial, but also through the collection of African countries who came together to campaign jointly on this convention with the African governments. So next slide, please. So I'm racing through this a little bit. That's Rose on the left there, and beside her is Fiona from the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, who was also an inspiring figure. And there you see at the end, when the convention, when the standard setting committee agreed to the convention and the recommendation, everybody just burst into song and dance, and there was a rumba going across the whole, you imagine through that big auditorium on the side of the workers group, this amazing colour of voice. And actually some of the African government representatives and some of the African employers representatives also joined in, because they also badly needed this convention. And it was an amazing sight. There was tears, and it was after 5 years of intensive campaigning, you know, the workers group had got what they wanted. So next slide, please. And that was the International Labour Conference full adoption, because it went then from the Standard Setting Committee into the International Labour Conference, made up of 187 member states, with government, employer and worker representatives in that big auditorium, and another big, even bigger auditorium in the United Nations building in Geneva. And there you can see Marie Walker-Clark in the middle, holding up her arm in celebration. She was the workers' spokesperson, as I mentioned, a woman of colour from the Canadian Labour Congress in Canada. And next to her, behind her, Kathleen Pachier, who's workers' group lead, the chair of the workers' group and vice chair of the governing body of the ILO. And Guy Ryder on the far right, who's the outgoing General Secretary of the ILO. And the rest are the employers' representatives and key people from governments and from the negotiating front bench. Next slide, please. Just a few of the, I think there was a slide just before that. So the women in the purple there, I wanted to put to give some credibility to the campaign carried out in the Ukraine. This was from the Ukrainian Trade Union Confederation, and the women actually made those scarves themselves and used the campaign logo on the slides, on the scarves, and had the most amazing campaign that was leading Ukraine to nearly get to the stage of ratifying the convention. Very sadly, we don't know where those women are at the moment. We have been in touch with some of them and send regular solidarity messages to them. The picture on the right is from the campaign in South Africa. It's just one of many examples. And that was from the Trade Union Confederation, Kasotho. And then at the bottom are I love this photograph because it's the women informal transport workers who had, in India, who had the most amazing campaign for the ILO convention. And they created what became known as the Women's Advocacy Programme. And the International Transport Federation worked very closely with the women to set up this advocacy programme to spread the message of why gender-based violence needed to be ended. And there was, you know, multiple examples of surveys, consultations and discussions with women informal transport workers about, you know, some of the horrendous examples of gender-based violence, of rape, of murders, of women transport workers themselves. So they were a really important force in the campaign. Next slide, please. So this was Sheila from the campaign of the transport workers in India. So it got strengthened, their campaign on violence and harassment got strengthened with the Convention 190 campaign. And there was something, and I think this quote says a lot of what really came out of the campaign, was the feeling that women globally are facing the same issues and fighting together. It was a big sign of strength of sisterhood. Anyway, on to the next. I'm worried about running out of time here. On to the next slide, please. This was the campaign in Honduras, and in fact, the women on the right there had just finished a big manifestation in Honduras, which was attended by, I think it was something like 10,000 trade unionists and feminist organizations on the day in, I think it was 25th of November 2019. Next slide, please. Truly global campaign, and in total there were over 1,200 national, regional and global campaigns and alliances led by women in over 85 countries and across multiple sectors across the world. They came together under one true global campaign with one clear message, and that clear message, stop gender-based violence at work, really resonated with everybody. The quote here is a joint statement from the International Trade Union Confederation and the GUFs, that's the Global Trade Union Federations, who represent different sectors. So there's one for public services, there's one for transport, there's one for the journalists, and there's one for the garment sector, and so on. And I think what the quote says, I'll just read out the middle part of the quote there. It's a trade union response to the resurgence of patriarchy, attendant risk of misogyny, racism, bigotry and intolerance, which also pervades our world of work. If applied, ratified and enforced, these instruments can change lives. Trade unions, feminist organisations, women's and human rights organisations will continue their alliance to make sure this happens without delay. Next slide, please. Inclusivity. I'm not going to read these quotes because I know you've got a busy agenda today, but just to say one of the really important part of the campaign, this is Fiona Magaya, who is in the photograph above. You know, this inclusive definition of violence and harassment that includes gender-based violence was really relevant for women in Zimbabwe who are working in the informal sector, many of whom work at night, who are often attacked going to and from work. And one of the great things about Convention 190 actually was that it includes travel to and from work where some significant risks occur, of rape, of death, of violence and so on in many countries. Next slide. Of the negotiations, this was Martla Keita from South Africa. The negotiations were long and hard, often with exchanges going backwards and forwards and often into the night, but we got there in the end. The workers' spokesperson was under enormous pressure, particularly when it became heated. I can't go into the discussions of how it became heated and how some of those heated discussions were resolved, but we document them in the book in great detail. Next slide, please. This was Emma from Indonesia, from the Indonesian trade union. There's two trade union confederations in Indonesia, KSBSI and KBSI, and they set up a coalition called End Gender-Based Violence in the World of Work. It was a national coalition with civil society organisations. It met monthly, and it's still existing today because they're still campaigning for ratification. And I was recently talking to Emma, and she said we're finally managing to speak to employers about why we need a change in the law, because the employers believe that just having something in the penal law, in the criminal law, is sufficient. And what Emma has said is that just recently they've been able to persuade the employers that actually we need to get this now into labour law. So that's unblocking a big problem. Next slide, please. This was Joanna Bernice, known as Nice, in the Philippines, from the Centro Trade Union, which is a community focused trade unions covering many, many sectors, and a kind of new form of social trade unionism. They focused very much on education and training and awareness raising with women in the informal economy and in many other sectors where women are disproportionately affected. Many also were victims of domestic violence. And what she said, we are building a women's movement in the trade union movement, and we're building feminist leaders and addressing patriarchy as a basis of inequality. Ultimately, we want to build a strong socialist feminist movement, and we see the struggle as a holistic struggle. This same woman, young woman, who's now the Deputy General Secretary of her trade union, stood up in the International Labour Conference just before the vote, because you were allowed to, there were certain people were allowed to speak, certain numbers from workers' groups and so on, and she was one of the selected people to stand up, and she stood up and she said afterwards, the great thing about it was that I was able to stand up in the United Nations and call out the patriarchy and why we needed this. It was very emotional, very, very emotional speech that she gave for the allotted 2 minutes. Next slide, please. These are all quotes from the book, because we interviewed all the women afterwards, as I mentioned. And this is a quote from the International Domestic Workers Federation, who did a massive amount of work with domestic workers around building their own agency and voice, and they were also represented at the negotiations themselves. Next slide. Strong focus on informal work, as I mentioned, and this, I wanted to just mention this woman, Lorena, from StreetNet International, because she said in one of the interviews that I did with her for the book, I interviewed her on several occasions. StreetNet International organises women across mainly developing countries who work on the streets as market traders, street sellers, and so on. And she realised at one stage there was a sticking point in the negotiations, and she demanded to go and talk to the governments of Africa. And she stood up in front of all of these government representatives from all of the nations of Africa in a very emotive way and told them why they needed to adopt this convention and include informal workers. She managed, that woman alone, managed to shift their perspective on why informal workers should be included in the convention. And it's the first ILO convention that formally recognises informal workers. Next slide, please. I think that's just about, we're nearly there actually. Next slide, please. Oh, and the obviously feminist union alliances. And then my final slide. Yeah, this was about the organising capacity of women. This is Kathy Feingold from the AFL-CIO union in the United States, which is the biggest confederation. You know, she spoke about the organising capacity of women, and how gender-based violence became the basis upon which women were organised. It was the one issue that women said, if we can't get rid of gender-based violence, we can't get equal pay, we can't get decent work, we can't get all of those other demands we have for better working conditions. And then finally, just some very quick conclusions in the book. Final slide, please. Thank you. Some of our observations really about the campaign strategies, about building of a movement of activism around institutional change. It's addressed the new reality of this new human right. I mean, it's quite profound actually that there is now for the first time in a global treaty, global human rights treaty, the right to work in freedom of violence and harassment. That is really significant development internationally. Clear learning about the importance of an intersectional feminist world of work. And one of the things that was really interesting was that women and women of colour from all over the world were arguing, yes, for a feminist world of work that was inclusive of all men and women, of all gender identities and sexual orientations, and wasn't exclusive just about women, it was also about men. And bringing men into the campaign. Men stood back in this campaign to allow women to have their agency. And I think, you know, for trade union movement, which, you know, historically is very male dominated, has been historically, is increasingly feminized. If you look in the UK, for example, there are now more women trade union members than there are men, and new forms of trade union organising have brought women into trade unions across the world. Very strong. We have very strong recommendations about what women can achieve when they stand in their own power. And, you know, we've been able to show in a global, you know, set of global negotiations with high-level negotiations with governments and employers, how women have stood in their own power to be able to negotiate on a par and gain respect for that. And I mentioned, you know, gender transformations in union agendas has really had a profound impact. And gender-based violence has really helped to shift those agendas as well. And then, you know, what I think is probably for us, you know, of global movement building is really a triumph of social dialogue and tripartism. And I mean, those of you who know anything about social dialogue and tripartism, that's, you know, either with governments, employers and unions working together, or bipartite with negotiations for collective bargaining agreements, workplace cooperation and so on. That there's been huge pushback on trade union organising, labour movement rights, and indeed pushback on gender equality. And this helped really to bring these issues back on the agenda. And I think actually helped to gain credibility around social dialogue because of the exemplary way in which those negotiations took place. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry it's a little gone on perhaps a little bit longer than it should have done, but it gives you a bit of an insight into our new book.
Thank you, Jane. I'm just giving you a little round of applause there. Thank you, Jane. That was amazing. It was a really impressive and clear presentation of a really long-term and really complex and inspiring, which was truly inspiring and world leading in so many respects for a convention. So that was, so thank you for that. Thank you. So I'm going to open it to any questions. Anybody would like to ask Jane while we have her? I have lots of questions myself.
There's the book.
Oh, there's the book. Well done.
Please order it for your libraries.
Yes, yes. We'll certainly get it into the library here.
There's a 50% discount on it at the moment.
Okie doke. Thank you. Julia. Julia, I have a question.
Hi, thanks, Jane, for a really great presentation. It's really inspiring to see that and to hear that. So thanks very much, really. My question now is really, I mean, you've mentioned that 11 countries so far have ratified the convention. And I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, if there's already some evidence of how like policy making now is taking place at the national level, if it's similarly inclusive and like many of these movements are still being part of like actually now translating the conventions and the recommendations into national policy.
Yeah, really good question, because this is the challenge now, is you ratify, what happens? So there's some really good examples actually of laws being changed. But I'll just give an example from the UK, because it's a bit disappointing, to be honest. The UK government has said that the convention is fully in line, or UK law is fully in line with Convention 190. We know it's not, because for two reasons. First of all, the UK Equality Act doesn't cover third-party violence and harassment. That's against, you know, could be against a nurse, a retail worker. As we know, during the pandemic, those groups were disproportionately affected by rising levels of violence and harassment. That's the first. And the second is that it doesn't, there's nothing in the law that gives you the right to support or paid leave in the event of, or paid or unpaid leave in the event of domestic violence. I live in France, and the French government is about to ratify the convention. And what I think was really impressive in France, which perhaps a little bit of contrast to the UK, was that the French unions did a very big detailed analysis of the law. And they said, right, there's 4 things we need to do. We need to make it obligatory to bargain for in the workplace, so that every employer has to bargain for with the workers collective bargaining agreements on an annual basis around sexual harassment, domestic violence, and all forms of violence and harassment, as they are obliged to do so in Italy and Spain now. and also to use the French government's due diligence procedures across the global supply chains to include gender-based violence. So that actually is quite a big change. It's going to be quite a few changes in French law as a result. In Italy and Spain, they're the two countries that already had domestic violence at work provisions already in their laws. So, you know, they were leading the world, actually, Italy and Spain, along with Canada and Australia. But in developing countries, we're going to see the biggest impact, actually, because, I mean, something like, 64 countries across the world have rather inadequate legislation on domestic violence, on sexual harassment at work. And, if you talk to the women in the Africa group of trade unions, they've been really, really active, and in Latin America and Asia as well. They've played a really active role in this campaign around implementation. And I'm just involved in another piece of research at the end of last year, looking at the impact of Convention 190, even in countries where it's not ratified. So the global framework agreements, for example, there are global framework agreements in the garment sector with most garment sector companies like H&M, Zara, all of those big companies. And they are now looking at pushing the terms of the Convention 190 through their global supply chains so that they impact on women in Bangladesh and Cambodia, Indonesia in the garment sector. And we collected, this was up until December last year, something like, I think it was about 60 collective bargaining agreements that are using the express language of Convention 190. There's a report in the, I don't know if you read The Guardian, but there's a report by Annie Kelly in The Guardian this week about the horrendous examples of sexual harassment in Tamil Nadu in India, in the garment sector, in H&M factories. And the unions used Convention 190 as part of that campaign. And Annie Kelly also did another article about in the garment sector in Lesotho. And again, the agreement uses in Lesotho, was the first agreement, it was in July 2019, just after the ratification, uses the express language of Convention 190 in the agreement. So there's lots of ways. Have a look at Annie Kelly's articles because they're quite accessible, and I've worked quite closely with her in trying to expose some of these terrible situations in the garment sector in Lesotho, in India and other countries. And she's done brilliant work in bringing these issues into the media attention as well.
Okay, Jerome.
Oops, yes, thank you for, sorry, I've lost my voice. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. Just on when you mentioned indeed that the UK didn't have third-party violence, and I was wondering during your presentation where you were talking about and then how would the convention work in practice compared to, for example, violence, like two pedestrians, not in the context of work, because how would there be a different instrument or there's one capacity of being at work, being attacked compared to just walking in the street? Is there an element of extra enforcement there, or because I suppose the other type of violence was probably more in the law already. What would that convention add to the general?
Sorry, Jerome, you're cutting in and out quite a lot.
Oh, sorry.
That's better. Just sit a bit closer to the mic.
Yeah,
Thank
sorry.
you.
No, about whether there's a difference in terms or protection, depending on whether you are being attacked in capacity of worker as opposed to in capacity of member of the public, when indeed you are self-employed or attacked by a consumer or customers or on your way to work.
Yeah. Okay, so the convention is integrated. It has an integrated approach to violence and harassment. It covers all workers in all work-related situations. It covers third-party violence and harassment is integrated into it, as is gender-based violence, and a broad definition of the world of work that includes, whether you're in social events, whether you're traveling to and from work, whether you're in the formal workplace, in places where sanitation, meals, and so on are covered. And it covers all workers, regardless of their contractual status. So that could be an informal worker without a contract. It could be somebody at the stage of an interview. It could be somebody who's left their employment because of sexual harassment, but can retrospectively take a case. And it covers trainees, interns, everybody. That's why it's really transformational in that sense. So what you have, and I think I picked up on what you were saying about enforcement, what you have effectively is a convention that's ratified by a government, and it's addressed to the government. So the government has to introduce laws that address all of those aspects of the convention. And those laws have to put obligations on governments, for example, to have a workplace policy, to cover it, to have prevention programs, to cover risk assessment as part of occupational safety and health. And risk assessment is where you assess the risks and then you look at mitigating them, to have policies on domestic violence, all forms of, and they define in the convention, it defines the different forms of violence and harassment. So it could be physical violence, it could be bullying, mobbing, harassment, so it could be verbal, it could be physical, it could be sexual. And all of those definitions have to now come into national laws. So this integrated approach, and the trade union movement argued very strongly right from the beginning to integrate violence and harassment because it's like a continuum. So, you get the worst forms of violence in the workplace would be murder, femicide, rape, and so on. But, you've got to cross that continuum, relatively minor forms of sexual harassment, which might be display of pornography in the workplace or harassing behavior of a manager of a worker. And the employers wouldn't accept that continuum, but they would accept the integration of violence and harassment into one definition. So I hope that answers the bit of your question that I think I heard.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean, I want to, it was also to compare to a situation where you're not in your capacity of work, because I assume that there is a law already. If you're simply like at a weekend walking in the street and get attacked, there must be already some protection for that. And then how does a convention that implies that you are attacked on your way to work, to part of the new convention, what's the difference of treatment between the two situations? Because in the first situation, I would assume that you are already protected in law. I mean, let's say in many countries, as a member of the public, as opposed to as a worker. But I don't know if that's the case.
Well, not the case, actually. No, not the case. I mean, you've got criminal laws that obviously if somebody is murdered or seriously attacked or assaulted, the criminal law would come into play. But you haven't got this covered in labour laws. And this will be directed to both labour and criminal laws. So if you take, for example, two areas where perhaps, the employers found it rather difficult to know what to do. Third-party violence and harassment, because there's no employer, so you don't have a grievance system. So what effectively, the laws should be doing is saying that there should be partnerships with the public authorities, that there should be prevention programs from the employers. If you take something like domestic violence, it's an intimate partner who may not be working in the workplace, but you can guarantee employment security for women workers who usually lose their jobs because of domestic violence. You can give paid leave to help them and support them. And the other area that I think is interesting is around informal workers, because informal workers, self-employed workers, you can bring them into a continuum of categories, are also, potentially protected, because and this is really, really interesting part of the convention. If we had more time, I could go into the detail of it. But one of the huge gains in the negotiations was to get recognition that the public authorities can be perpetrators of violence and harassment, which would be the case for many street workers and market traders, where the public authorities themselves, the police, commit acts of violence, harassment, and indeed sexual violence. So it's very broad in the sense, so where it's relevant to the employer, those duties are put on the employer. Where it's relevant to the public authorities, those duties have to be put onto the public authorities. And that's why the implementation of this convention is going to be so crucial, to make sure that everything that's in the convention, and that will come through mobilization at the national level from the trade unions, the women's organizations, NGOs, progressive employers, and it'll come through, you know, the review processes that the ILO has in place as well. Through they have an annual review, but also they have a committee of experts who regularly, or fairly regularly, periodically, I should say, review ILO conventions for their implementation.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jane.
And
Anybody else?
somebody said UCU. Yes, UCU is very involved in the campaign. And UCU actually was, you know, has had a very big campaign on violence and harassment. They did a big survey a couple of years ago and another one just recently on the education sector. UCU are members of Education International, which is the global union, who have been very active in this campaign. So ask UCU what they've done around Convention 190 in the campaign, and there's information on their website as well. They've been very, very active, and the education sector has been particularly active on third-party violence and harassment. You know, third-party violence and harassment from, you know, it could be pupils, students, it could be parents, family members, and so on.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question from Ross.
This is just absolutely awe-inspiring, Jane. It really is. It's quite extraordinary, and I don't know which to be more impressed by, whether the substantive achievements or the process through which they were achieved. It's just mind-boggling, and I just wonder really whether it really is a new model, whether it's unique, whether there are other things that could build on it in other spheres of, you know, particularly in the workplace. I'm particularly interested in young people's exclusion from the workplace, but you know, that would be one of many examples. Can it go somewhere like that?
Yeah, I think obviously it does set a model for, you know, a very good example of tripartism and social dialogue on the one hand. But I think it really shows when you've got a global movement behind the negotiations for an instrument like this, then, you know, it has an impact. It has an impact on the governments, on the employers. We saw huge shifts in their positions because of the global campaign. So I think, I mean, my experience of working with trade unions and international organizations for, you know, more than 25 years, it's the most unprecedented example I've seen of a global campaign, and one with a very positive outcome as well. So I think, you know, it has been unprecedented. Thanks very much, Ross, for your very kind comments.
If I had a hat, I'd take it off now.
Oh, you might be one of the people who might like to review the book for us.
I think we're
Right.
going to. Is there anybody else with any questions? I, of course, have been itching to ask Jane a question, and my question is, I mean, Jane, you know, you're right in there in that process, in that campaign, and I'm sure there are many, many memorable moments. Not least when when the agreement from the ILC came through, and you know, what have you. But which memorable moment most do you think will be most enduring for you?
Well, I suppose there were lots, but one, you know, when the convention was adopted, and in fact, the funny thing was, Nicola, you were at a WHO meeting in Geneva, across the road, actually, at the time this was happening. But for me, that you know, the moment it was, you know, the final vote in the International Labour Organization, you know, the International Labour Conference. I mean, we were all, you know, exhausted, crying, you know, just like jubilation that this new human right had just been agreed. But there was a moment last year, actually, when I was just before the pandemic, I started doing some work with the trade unions in Cambodia in the garment sector. You know, mostly, you know, women who right across. I mean, there were through via, I think it's 26 different garment factories for global brands, and in the end, I had to do the training online, which was a shame because of the pandemic. But anyway, I did, over a period of 2 years, several training sessions with them, with, you know, various distance learning opportunities in between and so on. Anyway, they were all negotiating agreements on gender-based violence using the terminology of Convention 190. But at the first training session, I remember this young garment worker. She was tiny, and she looked about 17 or 18, which would be very typical in the garment sector, actually, young women. And she stood up in the training room. I was doing this remotely from France, and she stood up in the training room and she said, gave this long speech about Convention 190, and she came from the north of Cambodia, from a garment factory that wasn't even near the, you know, the center of, you know, the capital city, Phnom Penh. And I just thought, this convention has reached women who, you know, are in the northern part of Cambodia, in a rural area where there's this huge, you know, kind of set of garment factories, and she's a migrant worker as well. And I just, that for me was a moment of awe, actually, that it had reached these women, and they were using the language of Convention 190. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your most memorable moment, and I'm sure you have lots of them, and I look forward to hearing more of them in due course. Thank you so much, Jane. You've been a star, as always, as ever. We're really, really pleased that you accepted to come and talk with us this morning. And thank you to everyone who has joined this morning. I think some people have had to head off to meetings, but we still have a big group here. And yeah, let's all use the applause reaction that technology affords us.
And thank you very much, everybody. It was great. It was great to have this opportunity to do something through the Open University as well.
Yeah, we'll have you back. We'll have you back.
Happily.
For sure.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Really inspiring.
Bye, everybody.
Really, really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
Bye,
We're going to okay. We're going to break for maybe
we might
10
stop
minutes.
recording now.
Yeah, let me just do that.